Hi, everybody, and welcome to another iWoofs with your host, Dr. Ian Dunbar.
Hi there.
Kelly Dunbar.
Hello.
And me, Jamie Dunbar. So today we're going to continue our series, as it turns out, on myths in dog training. Because we tend to dive deep when we start a topic, and there's a lot more myths in dog training.
It was a major myth.
It was a major myth. So
I would say the major myth.
we're going to tackle another major myth.
Yes.
The myth, the umbrella of various myths, I suppose, the myth type that prevents people from beginning training in general. So one of the ones, I think kind of the founding myth that got serious puppy training started in the very first place was the myth that you cannot train a puppy until they're 6 months old, which I guess is less prevalent now.
6 months or 12 months.
Or 12 months.
Yeah.
But so, you guys want to talk a little bit about that myth? Have you heard that in your,
Once or
training
twice.
lives?
Oh, absolutely. Before I started dog training,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
you're having a puppy and waiting to go to school, waiting
Mm-hmm.
to go to school.
Well, 35 years ago, we rang round. I rang round when I got to Omaha, and 50 training schools in the Bay Area, and you couldn't start till.
So where do you think this myth came from? Because it seems like, just from a common sense perspective, pretty silly.
Probably because, training is looked on as being like regimented and it's work, and that a puppy is not old enough to take the corrections, meaning physical corrections. A wonderful example is there's a wonderful retriever trainer in England. She used to win international competitions with her dog. She's being interviewed on TV. And the question was, so what do you think of this new puppy training, making training fun and turning it into a game? She says, oh no, training is work, and it's impossible to start training until a puppy is 6 months old. As she's saying that to camera, she has an 8-week-old puppy and she's playing fetch with a pheasant wing. So she's making it fun and she's training the puppy.
But that wasn't training. That was something else entirely.
It's absolute preparation.
That's the myth that would be the myth that training is work and not fun, and that training can't be fun, right? So that does, I think, lend itself to this myth that you don't train them when they're young because training isn't fun. I think also because the training was so regimented and very much competition and obedience based versus pet dog. There was really no pet dog training track for most people.
It didn't exist till we created it.
So it was very formal.
Yeah,
there were exercises and and they had to be completed, and a lot of them would require attention span, and some developmental things that maybe a puppy.
Some specific things might be difficult at a younger age.
Developmentally, it might be, there's some things you don't really, which I would still argue if you do different methods, you can actually teach a puppy a downstay and all of that, but they didn't really get that. And so if you're using certain methods and not making it fun and not incrementally building, but just kind of expecting the exercise to work, I think, we won't
I think
have
also
success with the puppy.
Back then, training was in the dark years, that luring had fallen out of favour, shaping had fallen out of favour. These
training had fallen out of favour.
Yeah, these were popular training techniques back in the 19th century. And so now, because they weren't luring, and they weren't if they weren't luring, training was very slow to teach the dog what to do. And if you weren't shaping, some things like retrieval could be very difficult. And so what happened was the dog often didn't do it. And the major feedback was a physical correction. And that was unsuitable for puppies. As soon as we bring back... don't look at the lights.
Pardon me.
Sorry. Bless you.
Was that a funny sneeze, Dad?
No, I was just trying to cover it up. It's like misdirection. Look out here, And
I'm allergic.
I think once we brought back luring, training speeded up, and it was entirely appropriate for puppies. And then when shaping came along, things like retrieval became easy, and it took a lot of pain out of training. And because now it wasn't necessary to teach by correction, which is kind of a conundrum right there. No, we train puppies, and largely because I'm me. It's got to be fun, right? Or else why do it? You know me, I'm really lazy. And unless it's I'm having a good time and we're playing games, you know, why shouldn't it be fun? That's the question I ask people.
Well, was there also something about? I mean, you know, something changed, maybe right with you, where people weren't using psychology and learning, you know, the principles of learning.
No, it's
to train dogs, so they didn't understand early learning as it applies, you know, to dogs versus.
Training was it was procedural, and in obedience and in working dog training today, protection training, sheepdog training, drills do this. If you're heeling, move forward with your left foot, and if you're gonna leave the dog, move forward on your right foot, and have a leash this long. But they didn't have principles of learning. That consequences should be binary, analog, and they just didn't know that stuff. And the binary feedback all but disappeared, and it wasn't reward and punishment. It was almost exclusively punishment. And, you know, it must be binary. So I think principles in dog training, the fact that I was in the psychology department just by chance, you know, where I was studying behavior, that was huge. Because then we looked at things like, we asked questions, did the dog learn? How quickly is it learning? Because that's always the sort of litmus test for any training technique. And what we found was we were learning so fast. I remember it was my second trainer who at the time, #1 ranked obedience competitor in the country, and she came to watch puppy classes, and it was like week 4 or 5, and she was a golden owner, breeder. So I took a little golden and taught him utility signal exercise, and it blew her mind. She says, do you know how long that takes to teach? I said, well, not when you use science and you make it fun and you lure.
So I'm trying to figure out timeline-wise how this worked. So obviously people were doing procedural training, often based out of obedience competitions and or military training. Yeah. But then going on the other side of the military, you had, you know, the Brelands and they were using science to train, but it hadn't bled into. So you were doing psychology and they were using science.
What
and
they
psychology.
did for the military was all top secret back then.
So because they weren't doing it, we do have to say they were doing quite complex things.
And
with all sorts of animals. It secret. That's unfortunate.
But they did a lot of popular stuff too.
Later,
like you know, chickens that played basketball, or pigs that fetched stuff, and animals that played the piano, like for county shows. So they were coming up with, and that was shaping.
So that was using science procedures. As well. I mean, so these two things kind of eventually came together.
Science was hidden for a long time in training. And sadly, when it started, to me, Thorndike was the person who set off the field of learning theory. When he started to find out how animals learn, or people learn for that matter, he asked dog trainers and reward and punishment. And then it moved to the laboratory where a computer's training a rat. Well, what's the computer going to say when the rat gets it right? Good ratty, that was a good.
There's no relationship. There's no.
Well, what's the computer going to do when the rat gets it wrong?
Association.
You see, and that's where the shock came in. You know, because the computer.
They didn't know how to motivate a rat. I mean, they did feed them.
Well, that's what they'd had to do. Yeah. You see, the computer had to give a piece of kibble or a shock, and so we had a binary feedback, but it wasn't analog. It's always the same bit of kibble for everything the rat does, or the same shock. But when we change the trainer to a person, the massive difference there is we have language, so we don't need our feedback when they get it wrong should not be anything that causes fear or pain. It's merely re-instruction. Because if your child got it wrong, if your dog got it wrong, I'm sorry, it's your fault. We got to question the teacher here, and you haven't taught them, number one, what to do, or why it's so important to do it now. Like, as Kelly said, restaurant training, you know? Oh, that was the major myth.
That's the major myth. Restaurant training for children.
You know? Or for dogs, what you're doing is dangerous. We must communicate that we have different levels, or we require different levels of feedback. You can be loose and, you know, loosey-goosey for a while, but occasionally you must do what I tell you.
All right. So when you're talking about, so we're talking about the myth of
puppies,
not being able to train a puppy.
Yeah.
I do think that over the past, science came into training big time, let's say 15 years ago or so, 15, 20 years ago. That was great, but I think more recently people have brought play into training at a much higher level because it became too scientific then for a while.
Oh yes,
and it did go back to kind of this.
Well, and I think though that play is supported by science. Or I mean, I think,
of course, yes, but people taking it out, right?
right.
They were just like. Then people became little, robots in dispensers, and the dogs.
Right, in the name of science, I think people then potentially went the other direction.
So I feel like it's really kind of feeling out and coming into some kind of maturity.
I think science missed. To me, the part of science that wasn't continued was quantifying. Is the dog learning? And what is the learning speed and how well does he know it? Give us a percentage score. Instead, science concentrated on feedback. When do you shock? When do you give food? And training lost its soul. It really did. And that's why I love to watch a kid just playing with a dog and seeing all the things, probably like you when you were growing up with your little dog, and all the things the dog did because you're just talking to him.
Right.
And I call these people empathic trainers, and they just communicate well, and the dog follows them and settles down and does this
building
stuff.
Relationship, building play into your daily exercises and routines. I think that is a way that all young animals can learn.
Right.
That's what you do with Lily, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, so in thinking about this topic, one of the things that I keep coming back to is kind of the metaphor I use when explaining where Sirius came from and how it used to be that you couldn't train a puppy before 6 months, and how that was like saying, you couldn't put a kid in school until they were 14 or something.
Junior high or something.
Yeah,
and then you
that's pretty silly.
But
now during our discussion, I feel like what it kind of makes me realize is that training used to be, it wasn't just general education and play to improve a dog, but it was more specific. It was like the equivalent of having a child sit at a desk and do math, do multiplication tables or something.
Learn the
Exactly.
calculus
They
of
had to
regimented
start
in the
there.
world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those are things that a
You would
2-year-old
wait.
couldn't do.
No, exactly.
But I think what kind of has become more popular, and what I think we've helped popularize, is the notion that training is more general than that, and that training begins at birth, really. And that with my daughter who's 2, I've already begun schooling her in so many ways. I don't have her sit in a chair, and hold a pencil and do multiplication, but she's learning every day, and so much of that learning comes through play and through conversation.
It's the foundation of her future, and it's also making learning a joy.
Right. And I think the notion that you would not try to educate a child or a dog until any sort of cutoff date, seems,
Yeah, I think if we change the
silly.
words, it becomes so much easier to understand. Rather than saying we're training the dog, you are teaching the dog to learn. And that starts the day you get your dog. So if you're a breeder, it starts day 1. If you're a pet owner, probably 8 weeks. And it's never too early to teach it about the world around it and to listen to you, because we have to get along. We're 2 different species, and we just want the dog to do it our way by and large. Then we can let the dog do it the dog's way. And Zuzu has a weird thing where she will come and tell me that quite late in the evening, I really need to pee. She does it by standing like this and won't move, And if I'm reading the newspaper...
Thank goodness she does.
But I go outside and she doesn't need to pee.
Oh, never mind.
Because she has it on cue. And she just wants to go out. She probably heard something. She wants to go out front, have a sniff. She goes out, sniffs, comes straight back in, and then she'll sleep for an hour. Then I take her out to pee later, obviously.
So let's.
Well, this is one big myth. We're talking forever on this myth. So, I mean, maybe.
Well, that was great. I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head with the way. If you are asking for specific exercises,
then you might have to wait.
Developmentally, you may have to wait. I mean, you don't put you don't put a toddler into military boot camp or into a ballet.
Right. But that learning and education and teaching begins at birth, and that's the foundation for all of that stuff that comes later.
Yeah, I think another thing about the puppies was that people thought that puppies had severe constraints on learning, that they just weren't old enough to learn this and to retain it. And what we showed very quickly is, simple stuff like come, sit, stay, roll over. A puppy can learn that at 4 weeks.
Oh, and much more.
Yeah.
I mean, really.
And, they won't do a rigid stay for 3 minutes at 4 weeks, but they probably will at 8. if you teach them at 4 weeks.
Yeah. So definitely go
So
out
train
and
those puppies.
train those
I'll tell you,
puppies.
we'll end with a story if you like this. I had a trainer come to visit from Australia and he wanted to see the puppy class. He'd heard about them. He's a military trainer, right, at German Shepherds. And he came to watch the puppy class and all the way there he's like, you can't train puppies. I don't know why I came all this way. You can't train puppies. So he watches the class and I really put on a class for him. And we came back and Mimi had cooked dinner and we're sitting there. So Mimi asked one of her famous, insightful questions. He says, so what did you think of the puppy training class then? And he said, no, you can't train puppies. You simply can't train puppies. Those puppies must have been trained beforehand.
You can
They were ringers.
you can train zygotes.
Yes.
They learned it in the fetus, in
Born
the
trained.
uterus. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.